Imagine dying with one belief, and then suddenly waking up in a whole new reality. You might think this is impossible, but near-death experiences show that this happens to a lot of people. From 35,000 feet, the world seemed distant, almost theoretical, much like my relationship with faith had become, though I wouldn't admit that to myself for several more hours. My name is Kareem Syed, and at 43 years old, I had achieved everything society told me marked success. CEO of a thriving tech consulting firm, respected elder in my mosque, and patriarch of a picture-perfect family in suburban Connecticut. The laptop screen before me displayed quarterly projections that would have normally commanded my full attention. Instead, my mind wandered to the morning's prayer, when I'd felt that familiar hollow sensation despite the precise execution of each movement. The sensation had been growing stronger lately, like a shadow lengthening at sunset, but I dismissed it as simple fatigue from too many cross-country flights and late-night meetings. "More coffee, sir?" The flight attendant's voice pulled me from my reverie. I declined with a polite smile, checking my watch, 2 more hours until landing in San Francisco for what should have been a routine board meeting. My fingers absently traced the prayer beads in my pocket, a habit that had long since become more mechanical than meditative. The cabin lights flickered, followed by the captain's voice announcing unexpected turbulence. I'd flown this route dozens of times and barely registered the warning, even as the seatbelt sign chimed on. The first violent shake of the aircraft seemed almost personal in its intensity, as if some cosmic hand had reached down to rattle my carefully constructed world. What happened next emerged in fragments. The oxygen masks dropping, a child's cry cut short by the roar of depressurization, my own voice joining a chorus of prayers in various languages. The world tilted sideways, and I found myself staring directly at the ground through my window. The clouds no longer a peaceful blanket, but a rapidly approaching terminal point. Time stretched like taffy, allowing me to notice the strangest details. A woman 3 rows ahead clutching a photo to her chest, the flight attendant's broken necklace floating in the air like suspended mercury, the bizarre calm that settled over me as I realized these were my final moments. My last conscious thought wasn't of balance sheets or board meetings, but of my daughter Amira's question from that morning, "Baba, how do you know Allah is listening?" The impact, when it came, didn't feel like an ending at all. Instead, it felt like stepping through a door I'd always known was there but had never noticed. The physical pain was present but distant, as if happening to someone else. My consciousness separated from the chaos around me with the gentle inevitability of a leaf releasing from its branch in autumn. I watched from somewhere above as emergency responders swarmed the wreckage. Their movements seemed choreographed, a dance of urgent purpose as they extracted bodies, some moving, others terrifyingly still. I saw them reach my own form, bloodied but somehow intact, and begin chest compressions. The scene felt like a play I was watching from the balcony, emotionally engaging but fundamentally separate from my current reality. The space around me began to shift, not darkening exactly, but changing in quality, like water becoming steam. The physical world with its sharp edges and defined boundaries began to blur and soften. What replaced it wasn't the paradise I'd been taught to expect, nor the judgment I'd been trained to fear. Instead, I found myself in a state of being that defied the limitations of earthly description. The first thing I noticed was the absence of weight, not just physical weight, but the weight of expectations, of obligations, of the countless masks I'd worn throughout my life. The burden of maintaining appearances, of being the perfect Muslim businessman, of never questioning too deeply or straying too far from accepted truths, all of it fell away like shed skin. In this space, every prayer I'd ever uttered hung suspended like stars, but I could now see them clearly for what they were. Some genuine appeals from the heart, others mere performances, rituals completed out of duty rather than devotion. The sight should have filled me with shame, but instead, I felt only a profound sense of understanding. Each prayer, whether sincere or hollow, had been a step on the path that led me here. A presence began to make itself known, not through any physical manifestation, but through a gradual awareness, like realizing you're not alone in a room you thought was empty. It carried no judgment, only an infinite capacity for understanding that made me want to weep. The presence felt simultaneously foreign and deeply familiar, like a long-forgotten memory suddenly recalled. The figure that eventually coalesced before me defied easy description. It shifted between forms, sometimes appearing as my late grandfather who first taught me to pray, other times as a being of pure light, and occasionally as a mirror reflection of myself, but somehow more real, more authentic than the image I saw in mirrors during life. "You've carried many questions," it said, in a voice that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to my consciousness. The words weren't in Arabic or English or any earthly language, yet I understood them perfectly. Questions you were afraid to even acknowledge to yourself. Memories began to surface. Moments of doubt I'd pushed away, instances of cognitive dissonance I'd ignored, times when my faith had felt like a comfortable prison rather than a path to truth. I saw myself standing in my mosque, leading prayers while part of me wondered if any of this ritual actually brought us closer to divine understanding. The presence didn't just show me these moments, it helped me feel them fully for the first time. Each memory carried emotional weight I'd never allowed myself to experience. The guilt of questioning, the fear of being wrong, the desperate desire to believe without doubt. But here, in this space beyond physical existence, these emotions didn't feel like weaknesses or sins. They felt like essential parts of a spiritual journey I'd been too afraid to fully embrace. "Your faith," the presence continued, "has been like a map you followed so carefully that you forgot to look at the territory it describes." The wisdom in these words penetrated deeper than any sermon I'd ever heard, resonating with truths I'd always known but never dared to acknowledge. As we conversed, if conversation is even the right word for such profound exchange of understanding, I began to see how my relationship with faith had been shaped more by fear of being wrong than by love of truth. The rigid boundaries I'd drawn between belief and doubt, between my faith and others, between the sacred and the mundane, began to dissolve. The presence showed me moments from my life viewed through a new lens. My harsh judgment of a colleague who had left Islam, my refusal to attend my Christian friend's wedding ceremony, my automatic dismissal of other spiritual traditions without ever truly understanding them. But instead of condemnation, each revelation came with a deep understanding of why I'd made those choices and how they'd served me at the time. "You've treated faith like a fortress," the presence observed, "when it was meant to be a journey." The truth of these words illuminated countless moments in my life. Times when I'd chosen certainty over growth, dogma over discovery, judgment over compassion. The scenes from my life continued to unfold, but now they included perspectives I'd never considered. I saw how my actions had affected others, the subtle pain in my daughter's eyes when I dismissed her questions about faith, the resignation in my wife's smile when I insisted on strict religious observance without discussion, the distance that had grown between me and my non-Muslim friends as I became more rigid in my beliefs. But the most profound revelation wasn't about what I'd done wrong. It was about the vast potential for growth and understanding that had always been available to me. The presence showed me how every doubt I'd suppressed could have been a doorway to deeper wisdom, how every question I'd feared could have led to greater truth. I began to understand that my dedication to Islam hadn't been a mistake. It had been a crucial part of my spiritual development. But somewhere along the way, I'd confused the finger pointing at the moon with the moon itself. I'd become so focused on the rules and rituals that I'd lost sight of their ultimate purpose, to bring us closer to divine truth and to make us more compassionate beings. The presence guided me through these realizations with infinite patience, allowing me to process each new understanding at my own pace. Time had no meaning in this space, yet I felt the urgency of someone who has finally found water after a long drought. Each new insight built upon the last, creating a framework of understanding that was both entirely new and somehow deeply familiar. As my consciousness expanded to embrace these new perspectives, I began to feel a profound shift in my very being. The rigid categories and judgments that had structured my worldview began to soften and transform. I saw how all paths of sincere spiritual seeking pointed toward the same ultimate truth, even if they described it in different ways. This understanding came not as an intellectual concept, but as a lived experience. In this space beyond physical existence, I could feel the underlying unity that connected all spiritual traditions. It was like suddenly gaining a new sense that allowed me to perceive a dimension that had always been present but invisible to me. The presence seemed to note this shift in my awareness. "You're beginning to see with new eyes," it said, though seeing hardly described the profound way in which I was now experiencing reality. But seeing is only the first step. The real question is, what will you do with this new vision? Before I could formulate a response, I felt a sudden pull, not physical, but undeniable. The emergency responders had restarted my heart. The presence began to fade, but not before leaving me with a final message. "Remember, the truth you've glimpsed here isn't meant to be hoarded or hidden. It's meant to be lived." The return to my body felt like being pushed through a narrow tunnel. The physical world rushed back with overwhelming intensity. The taste of blood in my mouth, the pressure of hands on my chest, the urgent voices of paramedics, the wail of sirens. But even as consciousness slammed back into my physical form, I knew with unshakable certainty that everything had changed. My eyes opened to a world that looked exactly the same but felt entirely different. The paramedic above me smiled with relief, not knowing that the person they'd brought back wasn't quite the same one who had left. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I felt the weight of the journey ahead. How could I possibly translate what I'd experienced into words that others could understand? But even as that question formed, I felt a deep peace settle over me. The understanding I'd gained wasn't meant to be perfectly translated. It was meant to be lived, to be demonstrated through actions rather than explained through words. As the ambulance raced through the streets of San Francisco, I began to sense that my real journey was just beginning. In the sterile whiteness of the hospital room, reality began to reassert itself in stages. The steady beep of heart monitors, the antiseptic smell, the murmur of voices in the hallway. Each sensation helped anchor me back in the physical world. But the profound shift in my consciousness remained, like a lens through which everything now appeared in sharper, clearer focus. The first visitors arrived within hours. Colleagues from the local office, board members who'd been waiting for me at the meeting I never attended. They spoke of business continuity and contingency plans, their words washing over me like waves on a shore. I nodded at appropriate intervals, but my mind was elsewhere, still processing the vast expanse of understanding I'd been shown. When my wife Samira arrived from Connecticut, her eyes red from crying and lack of sleep, I saw her in a way I never had before. Beyond her role as my wife, beyond her identity as a Muslim woman, I saw a soul on its own journey, carrying its own wisdom and questions. The realization brought tears to my eyes, and when she hugged me, it felt like the first genuine embrace we'd shared in years. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered, and I could only hold her tighter, knowing that in a way, she had lost the man she'd married. The person who now inhabited this healing body was simultaneously more and less than the successful businessman and strict Muslim she'd known. The real challenge began when the local imam visited. He was a kind man I'd known for years, someone who'd always impressed me with his scholarly knowledge of Islamic texts. But as he began to recite the traditional prayers for healing, I felt a disconnect between the ritual's outer form and its inner meaning that I'd never noticed before. "Allah has given you a second chance, brother," he said warmly after finishing the prayers. "Perhaps this is a sign to devote yourself even more deeply to your faith." I looked at him, seeing both his sincere concern and the limitations of his understanding. "Yes," I replied carefully, though perhaps not in the way you might expect. Something in my tone must have alerted him, because his expression shifted slightly, showing the first hints of concern. As my physical recovery progressed, the hospital room became a kind of confessional booth. Visitors would arrive expecting to find the old Kareem, only to encounter someone who listened more than he spoke, who answered questions with questions, who seemed somehow both more present and more distant than before. My daughter Amira, visiting after school one day, was the first to directly address the change. "You're different, Baba," she said, studying my face with the unfiltered directness of a teenager. "Not bad different, just different." I smiled, remembering her question about Allah listening. "Remember what you asked me the morning of my accident?" When she nodded, I continued, "I think I finally have an answer for you, but it's not the kind of answer that fits in words very well. The real test came during physical therapy, when I had time to reflect on how to integrate my experience into my daily life. The physical therapist, a young woman named Sarah, noticed my contemplative mood during our sessions. "You know," she said one day as she helped me with stretching exercises, "most people who survive what you did come out of it changed. Some find religion, some lose it, some make peace with death, others become terrified of it. What did you find?" I looked at her thoughtfully, appreciating her directness. "I found that what we call religion is like a finger pointing at the moon," I said, echoing the insight from my experience. "The finger is useful, but it's not the moon itself." She paused in her work, considering this. "That sounds controversial, especially coming from someone I've heard was quite religious." "Truth often is," I replied simply, already sensing the challenges that lay ahead in expressing these new understandings to my community. As my discharge date approached, I began to feel both excitement and apprehension about returning to my regular life. How would I lead prayers at the mosque now, knowing what I knew? How would I handle the expectations of my religious community? How could I share what I'd learned without alienating those whose understanding was different from my own? The answers began to emerge organically through small interactions. When a Christian nurse mentioned saying a prayer for my recovery, instead of my old polite but distant response, I found myself engaging in a deep discussion about the nature of prayer itself. When a Buddhist patient in the physical therapy room spoke about impermanence, I could now see how his tradition's wisdom complemented rather than contradicted my own understanding. My wife noticed these changes with a mixture of curiosity and concern. One evening, as she helped me pack for discharge, she finally asked the question I could see had been weighing on her mind. "Are you still Muslim?" I took her hand, choosing my words carefully. "I'm still connected to the truth that Islam points toward," I said, "but I've learned that truth is bigger than any one tradition's description of it. The Quran itself says, 'We have appointed a law and a practice for every one of you.' Had God willed, He would have made you a single community." I think I finally understand what that means. She was quiet for a long time, processing this. "I don't understand everything you're saying," she finally admitted, "but I can see that whatever happened to you during the accident, it was profound. I just hope it doesn't pull us apart." I squeezed her hand gently. "On the contrary," I said, "I think it's going to help me be more present, more honest, and more loving than I've ever been. The question is, are you willing to take this journey with me?" Her answer was to lean forward and rest her forehead against mine, a gesture of intimate trust we hadn't shared in years. In that moment, I felt a deep gratitude for the accident that had seemed like an ending but had actually been a beginning. As I signed the discharge papers the next day, I knew that the real challenges lay ahead. The physical healing had been the easy part. Now came the deeper work. Living authentically in light of what I'd experienced, helping others find their own path to understanding, and building bridges between the different ways humans have developed to approach the divine. The sunshine felt different on my face as I wheeled out of the hospital, brighter somehow, more immediate. Every sensation seemed heightened. The brush of wind on my skin, the sound of birds, the smell of approaching spring. The world was exactly as it had been before my near-death experience. Yet everything had changed because I had changed. The idea crystallized during that car ride home, each mile bringing greater clarity to my vision. The center would be more than just another interfaith dialogue space. It would be a place of genuine transformation, where people could safely explore the questions that kept them awake at night. I could already see it. A renovated warehouse in a quiet part of town, with high ceilings and natural light streaming through large windows, creating an atmosphere of openness and possibility. The first few months after my return were as challenging as I'd anticipated. News of my changed perspectives spread through the Muslim community like ripples in a pond, growing more distorted with each retelling. Some claimed I'd converted to Christianity, others that I'd lost my faith entirely. The whispers followed my family to the mosque, causing Amira to come home in tears one day after hearing someone call her father a lost soul. But for every person who pulled away, someone else drew closer. Sarah, my physical therapist, became one of our first regular visitors when we began holding informal gatherings in our living room. She brought friends who brought friends, and soon our Sunday discussions were drawing people from all walks of life. Burned-out priests seeking renewal, young Muslims wrestling with doubt, secular seekers looking for meaning beyond materialism. The transformation of my home into an impromptu spiritual center wasn't without its tensions. Samira initially struggled with hosting discussions that seemed to challenge everything we built our marriage on. But as she observed the genuine healing taking place, her resistance softened. One evening, after a particularly moving session where a young woman shared her journey of reconciling her faith with her identity, Samira turned to me and said, "I think I'm beginning to understand what you experienced in that space between life and death." The formal establishment of the Center for Spiritual Renewal came almost a year after my accident. We found an old textile factory with exactly the kind of open, welcoming space I'd envisioned. The renovation became a community project, with volunteers from different faith traditions working side by side. Their conversations about paint colors naturally evolving into discussions about the nature of reality and the purpose of existence. What made our approach different was its focus on direct experience over doctrine. We didn't try to convince anyone to abandon their faith tradition. Instead, we helped them dive deeper into it while remaining open to the wisdom found in other paths. The center became known as a place where you could bring your doubts without being offered easy answers, where questioning was seen as a form of devotion rather than a lack of faith. Perhaps the most surprising development came 3 years after opening the center. During a regular morning meditation session, I looked up to see Ahmad, the imam who had visited me in the hospital, standing uncertainly in the doorway. After the session, he approached me with tears in his eyes. "I came to convince you to return to the straight path," he admitted, "but sitting here, I felt something I haven't experienced since I was a young man first falling in love with Islam. It's like I've been teaching people to read music without ever letting them hear the symphony." Ahmad became a regular presence at the center, his deep knowledge of Islamic texts providing a fascinating counterpoint to our experiential approach. Together, we developed programs that helped people bridge the gap between traditional religious practice and direct spiritual experience. The center grew beyond anything I could have imagined during that car ride home from the hospital. We established programs for interfaith couples, support groups for people experiencing spiritual transformations, and workshops that helped religious leaders reconnect with the mystical roots of their traditions. What had begun as my personal journey became a movement, touching lives in ways I never could have orchestrated on my own. 10 years after the plane crash that changed everything, I stood on the center's rooftop garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that still filled me with awe. Samira joined me, her hand finding mine with the easy familiarity of shared understanding. Below us, the evening's gathering was beginning, a mix of voices and languages rising up like a prayer. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Leaving your old life behind?" I thought about the successful business I'd walked away from, the status I'd lost in my old community, the comfortable certainties I'd abandoned. Then I thought about the lives transformed, the bridges built, the healing I'd witnessed. How can I regret following the truth? Everything I lost made space for something greater to emerge. She nodded, understanding. We stood in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars became visible. Somewhere in that vast expanse was the space I'd visited during my near-death experience, but I no longer needed to go there to feel its truth. I had found my way to live it here, in the everyday miracle of existence. As we turned to join the gathering below, I felt that familiar presence, the one I'd encountered in the space between life and death, not as something external now, but as the very essence of being that flowed through everything and everyone. The journey that began with my death as a certain kind of Muslim had led me to a life more rich with faith than I could have imagined, a faith big enough to embrace all paths that lead the human heart toward truth. The sound of singing rose from below, a Sufi chant harmonizing with a gospel hymn, creating something new and beautiful from the blend of traditions. As Samira and I descended to join our community, I smiled, knowing that every ending is just another beginning in disguise, and every death contains within it the seeds of resurrection. Looking back now, 15 years after that fateful flight, I understand that what seemed like a tragedy was actually a divine gift. The center has grown beyond our initial location, with sister facilities opening in several countries. Each one serves as a beacon for those seeking to bridge the gap between religious tradition and spiritual truth. My daughter Amira, now a religious studies professor,